The shot was not supposed to happen. Not in the way that accidents were not supposed to happen, where the accident was the product of a failure somewhere in the chain of things that were supposed to prevent it, and the failure was what no one had anticipated. The shot was not supposed to happen in the way that deliberate decisions were not supposed to happen, where the decision had been made by someone who understood exactly what they were deciding and had decided it anyway, which was a different and more significant kind of not supposed to happen because it meant the chain that was supposed to prevent it had not failed. It had been bypassed. Commander Yael Adeyemi was in a shuttle, a diplomatic shuttle, the kind that was formally designated in 3 separate treaties and 4 conclave protocols as protected transit, the kind that carried the specific identification, codes that made it unmistakably clear to any weapons system looking at it what it was and what the conventions said about what you did not do to it. The codes were broadcasting. They had been broadcasting since the shuttle left Conclave Station Primara 4 hours ago. They would continue broadcasting until the shuttle reached its destination, which was the Valith Imperial Orbital Station, where the preliminary sessions for what the Conclave's diplomatic division was calling the Framework Renewal were scheduled to begin in 36 hours. The Framework Renewal was the renegotiation of the 900-year Peace Pact. The Pact had been signed 900 years ago between the Galactic Empire and a coalition of civilizations that had included, at the time, 4 of what were now Earth's closest partners in conclave space. The Pact had established the territorial boundaries and the trade corridors and the non-aggression commitments that had structured the region's geopolitical architecture for 9 centuries. It had survived 11 changes in Valith imperial leadership, 3 attempted renegotiations by parties who found the terms increasingly unfavorable, and 1 near collapse during the period that the historical record called the Succession Crisis, when there had briefly been no one with clear authority to honor it. It had survived all of that. It was currently scheduled for renewal negotiation because it was the kind of agreement that required periodic renewal to reflect the civilizational changes that 900 years produced, and because the Valith Empire's current administration had formally requested the renewal session through the Conclave's diplomatic apparatus, and because the Conclave's diplomatic division had assessed the request as genuine and had assembled the negotiating team that the session required. Commander Adeyemi was the team's advance officer. She was not the lead negotiator, which was a role reserved for a senior diplomat who was traveling on a separate vessel that would arrive 12 hours after the advance team. She was the person who went ahead to confirm that the venue was prepared, that the security arrangements were in place, that the 17 logistical details that preceded a negotiation of this significance had been addressed and could be confirmed as addressed before the senior staff arrived. She was good at this. She had been doing it for 9 years, traveling ahead, assessing, confirming, communicating back to the senior team what they needed to know before they arrived. She had done it in 43 bilateral sessions across 11 different imperial and sovereign territories, and she had been good at all 43 of them. She did not know that this was not going to be the 44th. The weapons discharge from the Valith patrol vessel designated IVN Sovereign Protocol occurred at Air 847, 18 minutes before the shuttle was scheduled to enter the orbital station's docking approach. The Sovereign Protocol had been in the corridor for 6 hours. Its presence was logged. Its patrol assignment was documented. It was where it was supposed to be doing what it was supposed to be doing, which was patrolling the approach corridor to the orbital station in the standard pattern that the Imperial Navy maintained for high-security diplomatic venues. The discharge was not a warning shot. The targeting solution on the shuttle was not the targeting solution of something that was trying to miss. The weapons officer who executed it had input coordinates that were correct for the shuttle's position, and had made a decision that was clean and deliberate, and that the Sovereign Protocol's command had authorized, which was the most significant element of what had happened, that the command had authorized it, which meant the decision existed. Somewhere above the weapons officer and the patrol commander in the chain that led to the people who were supposed to be the counterparty at the framework renewal session. The shuttle took the hit at 0847. At 0848, the shuttle's emergency systems transmitted a distress signal. At 0849, the shuttle was gone. Commander Yael Adeyemi had been in it. The Conclave's monitoring network received the distress signal at 0849. The relay reached Senior Arbiter Nalan at 0852. She read it and then read it again because reading it the first time produced a result that she ran again on the second reading to confirm, and the second reading confirmed the first. She called Ambassador Reyes. Reyes answered immediately. Nalan said, "The advanced shuttle for the framework renewal was fired on by an IVN patrol vessel at 0847. The shuttle is gone. Commander Adeyemi was aboard." There was a silence on the channel that lasted 4 seconds. 4 seconds was a long time for a silence between Nalan and Reyes, who had been in enough serious conversations to have developed the specific efficiency of people who did not require time to process before responding because processing and speaking happened simultaneously. 4 seconds. Reyes said, "Confirmed." Nalan said, "Yes." Reyes said, "The Sovereign Protocol." Nalan said, "Yes." "Authorized at command level." Another silence. Shorter. 2 seconds. Reyes said, "I need 30 minutes." Nalan said, "Take them." Reyes ended the call. Nalan looked at her display. She thought about 900 years. About the Pact, and what it had survived, and what it had not survived, and what the shot at 0847 had done to the architecture that 9 centuries had built. She thought about Yael Adeyemi, 37 years old, 9 years in advanced diplomatic work, 43 sessions. She had read the personnel file when Reyes had submitted the team roster for the framework renewal. She thought about what the 4-second silence had meant. She had known Reyes for 9 years. In 9 years, she had never heard that silence. She sat with it. At 9:28, 36 minutes after the call, Reyes called back. She said, "I need to brief the Security Council, today, within the next 2 hours." Nalan said, "I will convene it." She said, "I also need you to know something before the briefing." Nalan said, "Tell me." Reyes said, "Commander Adeyemi was not just the advance officer for the framework renewal. She was the daughter of Fleet Admiral Priya Adeyemi, the Fleet Admiral who commands Earth's combined fleet operations." Nalan held that. She said, "The Fleet Admiral knows." Reyes said, "The Fleet Admiral was notified 11 minutes ago." Nalan said, "And?" Reyes said, "The Fleet Admiral is at her station, performing her duties. She has formally recused herself from any operational decisions related to the Valith situation and has designated her deputy to cover those decisions for the duration." Nalan said, "She recused herself." Reyes said, "Immediately." Without being asked, Nalan was quiet for a moment. She said, "And you?" Reyes said, "I knew Commander Adeyemi for 9 years. She was one of the best people I have worked with." She paused. She said, "I will be at the Security Council in 90 minutes." She ended the call. The Security Council convened at 1100. All 17 arbiters were present. The session had the quality that sessions had when something had happened that morning that everyone in the room had been processing since it happened. And that had produced, in the processing, a specific kind of readiness. not readiness for a particular outcome. Readiness to be in the session, to be fully present in it, to do what the session required. Reyes walked in at 10:59. She looked like someone who had spent 36 minutes doing something specific after. The call with Nalan and the 90 minutes since doing something else. And the something else had been the preparation that this moment required. She had the composure that she always had in sessions of significance, and she also had something underneath the composure that Nalayan, who had been watching her for 9 years, could see, and that was not a breach of the composure, but was present alongside it. She sat down. She said, "The Security Council has been briefed on the incident at 0847. I want to address several things in the order that they matter." She looked at the council. She said, "Commander Yael Adeyemi was a diplomatic officer of the Galactic Conclave traveling on a protected transit vehicle under the identification codes that 9 centuries of treaty and 4 Conclave protocols designate as inviolable. The vessel that fired on her was an Imperial Navy patrol ship acting under command authorization. This is not an ambiguous situation in terms of what occurred and who authorized it." She said, "The 900-year peace pact contains language in its Article 7 that addresses the inviolability of diplomatic transit in terms that are among the clearest provisions in the Pact's 900-year history. The discharge at 0847 constitutes a breach of Article 7. The breach is not technical. It is material." She said, "The breach of Article 7 automatically triggers the Pact's Article 12 provisions, which were included in the original Pact, specifically to address situations where a material breach occurred. Article 12 provides for a formal determination of breach, a period of notification, and a response framework that the non-breaching parties may activate." Councillor Drethan said, "The response framework under Article 12. Reyes said, "Yes." Drethan said, "Earth is a party to the Pact." Reyes said, "Earth's 4 partner civilizations at the Pact's signing were incorporated into Earth's membership framework when Earth joined the Conclave 42 years ago. Earth is the legal successor party to those civilizations' Pact commitments." "Yes, Earth is a party," Drethan said, "and the response framework." Reyes said, "The response framework under Article 12 gives the non-breaching parties a 60-day window to formally invoke it. Invocation requires notification to the breaching party and a statement of the response being invoked." Drethan said, "What responses are available?" Reyes said, "Article 12 was written 900 years ago by people who understood the region and what the Pact was protecting. The response options are graduated. The first is formal censure with mandatory diplomatic engagement. The second is suspension of the trade corridor provisions. The third is suspension of the non-aggression commitments, which effectively nullifies the Pact's primary security architecture." She paused. She said, "There is a 4th option. The 4th option has never been invoked in 900 years. It was included in the original Pact at the insistence of one of the 4 founding civilizations, which argued that an agreement without a terminal provision was an agreement that could be exploited indefinitely at marginal cost, and that the terminal provision was what gave the other 3 options their meaning." Councillor Arias said, "What is the 4th option?" Reyes said, "Full dissolution of the Pact and activation of the original party's reserved rights, which are defined in the Pact's founding annexes." The council was quiet. Arias said, "The reserved rights." Reyes said, "Each founding party reserved in the original Pact the rights that they agreed to constrain for the duration of the Pact. The reservation was a negotiating mechanism that acknowledged that the parties were giving up significant operational freedom in signing the Pact, and that the freedom was not being surrendered but held in abeyance. Dissolution returns those rights to the parties. Arias said, "What rights did Earth's predecessor civilizations reserve?" Reyes said, "Territorial access rights throughout the corridor region, unrestricted military transit, and the right to position assets throughout the region without notification requirements." She let that sit for a moment. Drethon said, "Earth has not had unrestricted military transit or the right to position assets throughout the corridor region for 900 years. Reyes said, "Earth's predecessor civilizations agreed to constrain those rights when the Pact was signed. The constraint has been honored continuously for 900 years. The fourth option returns those rights." She said, "I want to be clear about what Earth is and is not deciding this morning. Earth is not deciding to invoke the fourth option. That decision requires the Security Council's awareness and the Conclave's diplomatic framework and a 60-day window of formal process. Earth is telling the Security Council what the situation is, what the legal framework is, and what Earth's position is." Nalan said, "What is Earth's position?" Reyes said, "Earth's position is that a diplomatic officer was killed in protected transit by an authorized weapons discharge from an Imperial Navy vessel, that this is a material breach of a 900-year agreement, that the breach requires a response, and that the response Earth is prepared to make is proportional to what the breach represents." She said, "The breach is not a miscalculation. The authorization at command level means it was a decision to fire on a Conclave diplomatic transit, a decision that produced the death of a Conclave diplomatic officer, a decision that the command level made while the framework renewal session was 36 hours away." She said, "Earth's assessment of why that decision was made at that moment by command-level authorization is that someone in the Valith Imperial command structure believed that the framework renewal was going to produce outcomes they did not want, and believed that destroying the advance team would disrupt the session. The disruption of the session was the objective." Drethon said, "And the death of Commander Adeyemi." Reyes said, "Was the cost they calculated was acceptable." The room was very quiet. Nalan said, "Earth is telling us that the shot was intended to disrupt the framework renewal." Reyes said, "Earth is telling you that the authorization at command level of a weapons discharge on a Conclave diplomatic transit 36 hours before a framework renewal session that the Imperial administration officially requested is not coincidental." Nalan said, "And Earth's response." Reyes said, "Earth will formally invoke Article 12 of the Pact. Earth will begin with the first option. Earth will notify the Valith Empire of the formal breach determination and demand accountability for the command-level authorization. Earth will require full transparency on who made the decision and under what authority." She paused. She said, "And if that transparency is not provided, or if the accountability is not genuine, Earth will proceed through the options in sequence." She said, "To the fourth." Nalan said, "The fourth option would dissolve a 900-year agreement that has structured the security architecture of this entire region." Reyes said, "The shot at Eero 847 dissolved a 900-year agreement that had structured the security architecture of this entire region. We are discussing what follows from what has already happened. The Council held that," Nalan said, "and the framework renewal." Reyes said, "The framework renewal session cannot proceed under the current circumstances. The session was predicated on the Pact's existence and on the good faith of the parties. Both are now in question." She said, "Earth does not want to dissolve the Pact. The Pact has been the architecture for 900 years. 900 years of structure is worth preserving where preservation is possible, she said. But Earth also cannot behave as though what happened this morning is something that accountability and transparency can address if the accountability and transparency are not real. If what the Valith Imperial Administration offers in response to the Article 12 notification is performance rather than genuine reckoning with what was authorized under their command, Earth will proceed to the fourth option. She said, not as punishment. As the only response that is proportional to a command-level decision to fire on a diplomatic transit. She looked at the council. She said, Commander Adeyemi spent 9 years preparing for sessions she never attended. She arrived ahead. She confirmed the details. She communicated back what the senior team needed to know. She did this 43 times in 11 different territories. She was good at it. She paused. She said she deserved to reach number 44. The room was quiet for a long time. Then, Nalayan said, the Article 12 notification will go through the Conclave's formal channels. Reyes said, yes. Nalan said, Earth will submit the formal breach determination documentation today. Reyes said, it is already submitted. I filed it before the briefing. Nalan said, and the 60-day window. Reyes said, begins today. Nalan said, and if the response is genuine. Reyes said, then we discuss the framework renewal in the context of what genuine accountability produced and what it means for the Pact going forward. Nalan said, and if it is not. Reyes said, then the fourth option is what it is. She said, and the reserved rights are what they are. She said, and Earth has been a conclave member for 42 years, and has been building for 42 years, and what 42 years of building looks like when the rights reserved 900 years ago are returned, is something the Valith Imperial Command level should have thought about before they made the decision they made this morning. She did not say it with heat. She said it with the specific quality that she had when she said things that were simply true and did not require any particular force of delivery to communicate their weight. The council received it. Nalayan said, the council will formally support the Article 12 process. She looked around the room. All 17 arbiters indicated support. Nalan said, Ambassador Reyes, the fleet admiral. Reyes said yes. Nalan said she recused herself immediately. Reyes said yes. Nalan said, without being asked. Reyes said, it was the right thing to do. She knew it. She did it. Nalan said, and she is at her station. Reyes said, she has a fleet to command. Nalan held that. She said, tell her. Reyes said, tell her what? Nalan said, that the council sees what she did this morning, that the council understands what it cost, that what she did this morning is the reason the process has the credibility it needs to work. She paused. She said, tell her we will not forget. Reyes looked at Nalan. She said, I will tell her. The session ended. Reyes walked out of the chamber and into the corridor and stood for a moment in the ordinary traffic of Conclave Station Primara, the ordinary business of the galaxy moving around her. She called Fleet Admiral Priya Adeyemi. The admiral answered on the first signal. Reyes said, the Security Council formally supported Article 12. The process begins today. The admiral said, yes. Reyes said, Senior Arbiter Nalan wanted me to tell you something. The admiral said, yes, Reyes told her. The channel was quiet for a moment. Then the admiral said, tell the Senior Arbiter that the process having credibility was the point. That was always the point. The response that is right is the one that holds together.